Ever since Ptolemy suggested the existence of a northern waterway connecting Europe to East Asia in the 2nd century, global superpowers have desperately searched for it. Such a trip would shorten trade routes between the East and West exponentially, and could have made a lot of people very rich. Back in 1497, a Venetian explorer named John Cabot became the first European to go looking for the Northwest Passage. He and his crew of 18 men ended up making landfall in the Canadian Maritime Islands. Although he thought he'd hit the jackpot his first time out because he mistook the place he landed in as Asia. A year later, King Henry VII authorized a second larger expedition for Cabot in 1498, a trip from which he never returned and where he was presumed to have died at sea. The search for the Northwest Passage remained both one of the most potentially lucrative and one of the deadliest voyages any explorer could make. Perhaps the most famous such mission was that of the Franklin expedition. In 1846, Sir John Franklin, a well-known Royal Navy officer who went on several earlier quests looking for the Northwest Passage, set out from England on what would turn out to be his final voyage. As the years wore on with no news of the expedition's fate, one person who refused to give up hope was Sir John Franklin's wife, the Lady Jane Franklin. She had been her husband's biggest supporter when he began his expedition. Now she became the driving force pushing for a rescue mission. She begged the Royal Navy to search for her husband. She even volunteered to go herself if no one else would. Lady Jane looked everywhere she could for help. One of these places she turned to was the world of the supernatural. The 19th century was the golden age of spiritualism. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, there were countless phony psychics and spiritual gurus who preyed upon grieving people looking for answers about their lost loved ones. Lady Jane consulted many such spiritual mediums looking for her husband. Most of these predictions didn't pan out. That is until the day she received a letter about the ghost of a little girl nicknamed Whezzy, who gave the exact location where the Franklin expedition could be found. The strange thing is that unlike all the other predictions Lady Jane had received about the lost expedition, this one was correct. Back in 1845, Sir John Franklin wasn't anyone's first choice to lead the Royal Navy expedition through the Northwest Passage. In fact, he wasn't even the second, third, or even the fourth choice either. At age 59, he was thought to be too old and too out of shape to handle such a rigorous journey. He had spent the past few years coasting on his celebrity status. By then, Franklin had been involved in 3 previous life-threatening expeditions. On each of these, he returned empty-handed, but he still had plenty of exciting stories about his close brushes with death. On one of these voyages, he and his crew nearly starved to death. His men had to resort to scraping lichen off rocks for sustenance and boiling their shoe leather to stay alive. Upon his return from that expedition, Sir John was given the rather disparaging nickname, the man who ate his boots. At the same time, survival stories like these made Sir John Franklin famous. Back then, the public ate up stories of adventurers in distant lands. Franklin wrote a best-selling book and won several awards for his contributions to science and geography. But by 1845, Franklin was in poor health. He was overweight and nearly deaf. Considering that by the mid-19th century, the average life expectancy was about 45 years old, Franklin was considered to be several years past his expiration date. But then he had also suffered a major setback both in his status and his career. He spent the past decade as the governor of an island known as Van Diemen's Land, a place that we know today as Tasmania. Back in the 19th century, the island was a prison colony that used its occupants as free labor for people in the United Kingdom. Sir John Franklin took steps to improve living conditions for the prisoners. But this didn't set well with his wealthy colleagues, who saw this as an attack on their bottom line. In the end, Sir John Franklin was removed from his position and forced to return to England. The newspapers called him a failure, and for a time it seemed like his life was over. But one person who never stopped believing in him was his loving wife, Lady Jane Franklin. As soon as they returned to England from Van Diemen's Land, Lady Jane became his biggest cheerleader. She knew it was Sir John's trips to the Arctic that made him a hero in the public's eyes before, so why couldn't it happen again? Sir John Franklin and Lady Jane practically begged the Royal Navy for one last shot at fortune and glory. John's name was at the bottom of their list of candidates to lead a new expedition to the Northwest Passage. But after pretty much everyone else dropped out because of how dangerous it was, this left only Franklin to lead things. In 1845, the British Admiralty granted Sir John Franklin permission to lead what would turn out to be his fourth and final expedition to the Arctic. The flagship, the HMS Erebus, was captained by James Fitzjames. Captain Francis Crozier would lead the sister ship, the HMS Terror. Captain Crozier had actually been on the short list of names ahead of Sir John Franklin to lead the expedition, although Crozier was passed over for the top spot because of his Irish ancestry, and what was thought of as his low social standing. One thing Sir John Franklin was determined not to do, follow the same mistakes that previous expeditions, his own included, had made. The two ships carried enough rations to last 3 years. This included more than 60,000 pounds of beef and pork, 23,000 pounds of sugar, 2 tons of tobacco, and even 9,300 pounds of lemon juice to stave off scurvy. The Erebus and the Terror were considered state-of-the-art for the day. They were both modified warships, which meant they were already reinforced to handle explosions from the deck-mounted mortars they each once carried. The ships were built of oak planking 8 feet thick that was further reinforced with iron plating along the forward waterline. They had state-of-the-art coal-powered steam engines that could be used both for propulsion and to heat the ship's cabins, as well as specially designed retractable propellers. They also brought with them a thermally insulated diving suit that would allow a diver to go underwater and break up any ice buildup on the hull. The ships also had their own libraries and collections of musical instruments to prevent boredom among the crew. They even had a cat, a dog named Neptune, and a monkey on board, courtesy of Lady Jane Franklin. All in all, this was considered to be one of the most well-provisioned expeditions in maritime history. The Erebus and the Terror left port on May 19, 1845. Lady Jane, her niece Sophia, and John's daughter from his first marriage, Eleanor, stood on the docks waving them goodbye. Lady Jane loved her husband deeply, and she believed that she would see him again, only this time he'd be hailed as a national hero once more. Over the next few months, the crew's spirits remained high. Sir John spent his nights regaling the sailors with his tales of daring-do from past expeditions. The sailors ate well, drank, sang, and danced the night away. A good time was had by all. Up to a point, that is. We know these things because the ship made several stops in ports along the way, during which time the sailors would write letters home. Based on these letters and other evidence uncovered over the more than 170 years since the expedition vanished, we now have a pretty good idea of the course the Erebus and the Terror followed. Captain Crozier once noted in a letter that this expedition appeared to be doing Sir John Franklin a world of good. He said the man looked 10 years younger than the day they left. Whenever they encountered any sort of emergency, Sir John handled it with all the grace and command of a seasoned officer. But there were problems on board these vessels that neither Franklin or his crew could foresee or control. For one thing, his men were exposed to tuberculosis. Early on in the trip, when the ship stopped at Whalefish Island, 5 men were released from the crew and sent home because they were ill. But there was also another problem none of the remaining 129 members of the crew were aware of. They were all slowly being poisoned. Among the provisions they brought with them were 16,000 cans of food. But those cans were all hastily assembled by the lowest bidder. This meant these cans were poorly sealed with lead solder. This lead then leached into the food inside the cans. In addition to that, many of these cans were so poorly sealed, they became putrid and prone to botulism. And on top of all that, the ships were both outfitted with lead water pipes, which would have reacted with the salt water and leached into the water supply. By July 1845, 2 months after the expedition left England, things grew even more serious when they reached the outskirts of the Arctic. The Erebus and the Terror landed in Baffin Bay in an area located between Canada and Greenland. The weather was poor, so they were forced to wait several nights for conditions to improve. While they remained anchored in the harbor, John invited a whaling captain and his crew to join them for dinner on board the Erebus sometime around July 26th. The crew told the whalers that they had more than enough provisions to sustain them through anything they might encounter. When they finally left Baffin Bay, the Erebus and the Terror continued west through a body of water called Lancaster Sound. From there, they planned on cutting through the Barrow Strait, a narrow strip of ocean just above Canada. This would take them northwest of Alaska. From what we know, the expedition actually made it pretty far. It's believed they only had about 300 miles left to go before they reached their goal on the far side of the Arctic. But then, the days turned to weeks, then months, with no more letters back home or news about the expedition. By 1847, 2 years after the Franklin expedition first set sail, many people began losing hope that they would ever hear from Sir John Franklin and his men again. But Lady Jane Franklin wasn't among them. She remained confident that she was going to see her husband again one day. Although the British Royal Navy didn't share her confidence, there was some talk of mounting a rescue operation to go after the lost ships, but the experts couldn't agree on where to even begin looking or a lot of the other details about how such a rescue operation should be conducted. Meanwhile, Lady Jane was growing impatient about all the stonewalling she received from the Royal Navy. She wanted them to stop talking and go out and rescue her husband. She was quite vocal about it too. This was considered positively scandalous for prim and proper ladies of the Victorian era who were expected to be seen but not heard. But Lady Jane refused to sit idly by and do nothing. She bought an apartment near the Admiralty building so she could keep making a nuisance of herself. She then consulted Arctic experts and pored over maps. She wrote letters to newspapers and tried to get the public behind her. She even reached out to some very influential people for support. One of these was her good friend Charles Dickens. Another was U.S. President Zachary Taylor, who she wrote to trying to get the Americans to launch their own rescue mission. She even proposed hiring a ship and doing it herself if no one else would. Lady Jane Franklin turned to any avenue that she could to find her husband. This included the spiritualist community. Spiritualism was booming throughout the 19th century. Ever since news broke that Sir John Franklin's expedition had been declared missing, numerous clairvoyants across Europe, Australia, and the United States had reached out claiming that they'd had psychic visions of Sir John and his ships. Some of these psychic mediums even claimed to have spoken to Sir John Franklin himself. In May of 1849, Lady Jane and her niece Sophia visited the London home of a medium named Ellen Dawson, who came widely recommended. Dawson had gained a reputation for her psychic abilities to locate lost jewelry and even people, too. Dawson claimed to possess the ability to astrally project her spirit and send it to other locations. So one evening, Lady Jane, Sophia, Ellen, and Ellen's mesmerist, a guy who went by the name of Dr. Hand, all gathered for a seance. A mesmerist, by the way, was sort of a combination spiritualist and hypnotist. Dr. Hand would hypnotize Ellen and help guide her through her journey to find the answers she was looking for in the spiritual plane. Basically, after Dr. Hand would put Ellen into a trance, he would ask her questions to lead her to what she was looking for. On this particular occasion, Dr. Hand instructed Lady Jane to wait in an adjacent room while he guided Ellen. Supposedly, this was to prevent Lady Jane from growing upset by whatever was revealed, potentially breaking Ellen's trance. And according to some reports, Ellen Dawson came up with some surprisingly accurate information. Although she had never met Sir John or even seen his two vessels before, she was able to provide some fairly accurate descriptions of both the ships and of Sir John himself. She also described the two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, being caught in ice. But to be fair, remember, Sir John was already famous by that point. He'd had illustrations of himself appear in books and newspapers. Likewise, descriptions of the two ships had appeared in print as well. Plus, it wouldn't be too big of a stretch to assume the ships were trapped in ice somewhere. Ellen also said that she saw two portraits hanging inside the man's cabin. One was of Lady Jane, and the other was Queen Victoria. This was correct as well. Ellen said she had a vision of men wearing fur garments and sitting around eating salted beef and biscuits. She said she could even smell the brandy on their breath. But when Sophia pressed Ellen for further details about the ship's locations or where they were headed, Ellen suddenly said that a cloud came over her, obscuring her vision. Just about the biggest revelation that Ellen came up with was that Sir John was still alive, though. None of this helped Lady Jane much with her search, but it still gave her hope that there was time to save her husband. Ellen Dawson wasn't the only psychic anyone consulted looking for Sir John Franklin either. In the fall of 1849, a close friend of Sir John's, named Captain Alexander McConaughey, learned of a psychic medium named Emma, also known as the Seeress of Bolton. Emma was the domestic servant of a surgeon named Dr. Joseph Haddock. He was also her mesmerist. Emma's psychic process was different than Ellen's. When Emma was placed into a trance, she needed to be in physical contact with an object that belonged to the missing individual. Lady Jane didn't personally meet with Emma, but McConaughey did so in her place. He took a lock of Sir John's hair that was given to him by the family along with one of his letters. During their first session, Emma said that she saw two ships, although one of them was now underwater while the other had been abandoned along the shore. She also said that Sir John was still alive, along with 3 or 4 other men, although the rest of the sailors were all dead. She even described Sir John's bald head, which wasn't common knowledge at the time. But this still didn't provide any tangible help in locating them. Alexander begged Emma for some sort of actionable information. So she did, sort of. She said that she was able to read the time on Sir John Franklin's watch, which showed a 7-hour time difference between where he was and London. She then looked at a map and pointed to a part of northwestern Canada known as Hudson Bay. This was an area south of Baffin Bay where Sir John's expedition was last seen by the group of whalers they dined with. But this was a place where neither Captain Alexander nor his contemporaries had ever considered looking for the expedition. That's because it didn't make a lot of sense for him to be there. To get to Hudson Bay, Sir John would have had to sail his ships nearly 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. Captain Alexander was skeptical of Emma's information after that. But he still went back to see her 2 more times. During his next session with her, she now placed the ships in a totally different region of the Arctic. This time Emma claimed the Erebus and the Terror were near Prince Regent Inlet, although this was at least closer to the vicinity where it was believed Sir John and his expedition conceivably could have gone. But then, during Emma's 3rd session with Alexander, she gave yet another location for the missing ships, now placing them 500 miles west of Prince Regent Inlet, closer to the Parry Island. Considering how wildly different all her psychic visions were, we can pretty much discount anything Emma said. Then in October of 1849, a full 4 years after Sir John's expedition was last seen, a new psychic came forward. A man named William Coppin wrote a letter to Lady Jane with a bizarre story to tell. The man said he was mourning the death of his 4-year-old daughter Louise, or Whezzy, as she was known. The little girl had died of typhoid, but as tragic as this was, William's 3 other children began claiming that Whezzy hadn't really left them. In fact, they said they could still see her spirit hanging around. According to the surviving children, their little sister's ghost began appearing to them surrounded by a blue light. In fact, the family so strongly believed that Wheezy's ghost was hanging around that they began keeping a place at the dinner table open just for her. Then one evening, Wheezy's 9-year-old sister Anne said she saw the words "Mr. McCrae is dead" written in an eerie glowing blue light on her bedroom wall. The following morning, Anne told her aunt about what she had seen. It turned out that this aunt actually knew a Mr. McKay. He was an old family friend, and when the aunt went to check on him, she learned that the man had died the night before. This seemed to indicate that not only could Wheezy communicate with the grieving family, but she could actually provide them with information that wasn't widely available to the public as well. At the time, the missing Franklin expedition was still big news. This gave Anne and her aunt the idea to ask Wheezy if she knew where the missing ships went. Since Anne and her siblings were the only ones who could see Wheezy, one evening she and her aunt went into one of the bedrooms and tried to summon the little girl's spirit. Anne said that Wheezy projected a vision on the floor that only she could see. She said that she could see the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by ice, which isn't all that different than any other psychics had claimed before. But in this case, Anne said that she could actually feel the frigid Arctic cold around her. She began shivering and grabbed onto her aunt's dress for warmth. Then she said that a glowing series of words began to appear in the bedroom wall. These said Erebus and Terror, Lancaster Sound, Prince Regent Inlet, Point Victor, and Victoria Channel. This was considerably more specific than a lot of the other psychic premonitions that had come before. Lancaster Sound was part of Sir John Franklin's planned route. Prince Regent Inlet was just a short distance west of that. But this still remained within the vicinity of where he might have gone. At the same time, Point Victory was a place on King William Island that was further south than anyone expected Sir John to have traveled. Also at that point, the Victoria Channel, also known as the Victoria Strait, hadn't even been discovered yet. Which makes it all the more difficult to understand how Anne could go on to draw such a highly detailed map of the Arctic. Remember, this was still just a 9-year-old girl we're talking about. Yet she was able to draw a fairly accurate map of the region that contained various landmasses and waterways that she should not have known about. When Anne's father, William, learned about all this, he knew he needed to share this information immediately with Lady Jane Franklin. This was good timing for everyone. Lady Jane had finally got enough support to finance a new private expedition to look for her husband. Even nearly 5 years later, Lady Jane still held out hope that her husband was alive. This new expedition involved a ship named the Prince Albert. It was scheduled to depart in May of 1850. Shortly before the ship took off, Lady Jane received a letter from William Copping that described the vision provided by the ghost of his 4-year-old daughter Wheezy. He even included the map that his daughter Anne had drawn. In the weeks leading up to the Prince Albert's departure, Lady Jane met with William, who provided additional details of his daughter Anne's vision. And what he told Lady Jane actually clicked with something Sir John had told her shortly before he left. Sir John told his wife that if he ever got in any trouble, he'd sail south toward the Great Fish River, about 100 miles away from Canada's King William Island. This island was also home to Point Victory, one of the other places mentioned in Wheezy's message. William Coppin's story about Wheezy hit on a few too many details for it to be just a simple coincidence. But the rescue mission involving the Prince Albert didn't go as planned. When the Prince Albert reached the Arctic, they were forced to turn back empty-handed because there was too much ice blocking their path. Then in 1850, 3 graves were found on Beechey Island containing the bodies of members of the expedition. These 3 bodies were excavated by archaeologists in 1993, and they proved to be remarkably well preserved because of the extreme cold. Tests were run on the remains, and they showed that they all contained high levels of lead poisoning, presumably from a combination of the lead solder used on the food cans and the lead pipes on board the ships. Then in 1851, a different voyage led by a man named Captain John Ray was surveying the same region of the Arctic. Ray came across a narrow body of water west of King William Island that he would go on to name Victoria Strait, which is pretty surprising considering that a little girl named Ann Coppin said she'd seen those words appear in a vision to her a little over a year before. Not long after, Captain Ray found several artifacts in the ice, including some telescopes, guns, silver forks, and spoons. Even a silver plate engraved with Sir John Franklin's name. Once word reached Lady Jane Franklin, she immediately put together another private expedition to return to the area looking for her husband. This mission was led by Captain Francis McClintock. When Captain McClintock got to King William Island in 1859, his men found further evidence that Sir John Franklin's crew had been there. They discovered one of Franklin's boats that had been overturned and used as a shelter, as well as some scattered human bones nearby. They also found a stone cairn, and inside that cairn were some letters that had been left behind by members of the expedition. One of these letters included some notes scrawled in the margins by Captain William Crozier, captain of the HMS Terror. Earlier letters written by the Erebus Captain James McJames made it sound like all was going well despite their unfortunate circumstances. Although Crozier's notes, which were dated April 25, 1848, paint a much less rosy picture. During the summer of 1845, Sir John Franklin led the ships through the Lancaster Sound as planned. But after they made camp during the winter, they found their ships had become trapped in the ice. Early on, the crew lost 3 men. Sir John had no choice but to wait it out for the spring thaw. This also left him with 2 options. He could either stick with his original route or turn south for a longer but potentially safer journey. Sir John chose to turn south. He believed the lives of his men were more important than fulfilling his mission. But this was a fatal error, because although the journey south appeared to be the safer move, Sir John Franklin had taken them along a path where the ice funneled together in an impenetrable clog. Sometime around September of 1846, Franklin's ships became stuck in the ice once again, this time just north of the Victoria Strait near King William Island. Then 9 months after the crew got trapped for the second time on June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. It turns out that the Franklin expedition had headed into the Arctic at one of the worst possible times they could have ever chosen. Although the ice should have melted enough to let them sail on once they reached summer, this just so happened to be a particularly severe period of frigid weather that stretched on for several years. Scientific studies of ice cores taken from the region showed that during a 50-year period spanning the years around 1845, turned out to be one of the coldest and iciest periods in recorded history, meaning the ice never thawed. By 1848, Captain Crozier ordered his remaining men to abandon ship and set out on foot south in the direction of a British fur trading settlement hundreds of miles away. But none of them ever got there. Archaeologists believe that most of the remaining crew died on the long march south across King William Island. 30 or 40 men made it as far as the coast of the mainland before dying as well. But they were still hundreds of miles away from the nearest outpost. Today, it's believed that the entire crew was slowly suffering from a combination of disease, food, and lead poisoning. Archaeologists have found unopened food cans scattered around some of the camps, which indicates that they figured out that the canned food had gone putrid and become poisonous. To make matters worse, the only natural food source to be found around King William Island were seals and fish, both of which were infected with a naturally occurring form of botulism that the local Inuit population had built up a tolerance towards. A tolerance that was not shared by the British sailors. In later years, a mass grave was found nearby containing piles of human bones. Archaeologists examined these bones and found cut marks from metal knives, which indicated that the crew had resorted to cannibalism. Back in the 1850s, Captain John Ray heard rumors of cannibalism from the local Inuits. But these rumors were largely dismissed because the Victorian people refused to believe that their fellow countrymen could ever do something so horrible. But we have multiple accounts from the native Inuits who either saw or directly encountered the remaining members of the expedition. The Inuits claimed to have seen one of the ships frozen in the ice, while they said the other ship sank. One story claims that a group of Inuit hunters actually climbed on board the ship still frozen in ice, only to find a stove inside still warm and several dead bodies on board. They also claimed to have once encountered a group of starving white men walking through the Arctic, dragging their boats and belongings with them. The tribe said they shared some food with them, but they didn't have enough for everyone, and eventually the white men went off and were never seen again. All of this meant that based on these accounts, all the psychics who said they saw John Franklin alive and well after 1847, well, they were just flat out wrong. The news for her husband's death was devastating to Lady Jane Franklin. Meanwhile, William Coppin made matters even worse when he sent a letter to Lady Jane demanding that she give public credit to the ghost of his daughter for providing information about the expedition's whereabouts. Although she politely wrote back to Coppin one last time, she cut off contact with him after that, and never went public about Wheezy's ghost or what she revealed. Author Shane McCorstein, who wrote the book The Spectral Arctic, A History of Dreams and Ghosts and Polar Exploration, thinks that Lady Jane feared she'd become a laughingstock if she ever revealed that she'd been consulting psychics. Plus, since the truth about her husband's expedition was uncovered by other explorers, there wasn't any reason for her to reveal that she'd ever turned to the supernatural for help. Although we now have a clearer picture of the Franklin expedition's fate, where the ships actually went remained a mystery for another 150 years. It wasn't until 2014 when Parks Canada, using information provided to them through stories handed down by the Inuit people, were able to locate the flagship HMS Erebus. Most of the vessel was found largely intact, submerged in just 36 feet of water. It's unclear exactly what sunk it, but the ship was right there in the Victoria Strait, just like Wheezy's message said it would be. 2 years later, the HMS Terror was found along the southwestern coast of King William Island, which, as I mentioned, is also home to Point Victory, all of which were mentioned in Wheezy's message from the great beyond. So did the ghost of a little girl really predict where the Franklin expedition could be found? Well, there are some additional details that pour cold water on the story. It turns out that many of the details of Wheezy's predictions described here actually comes to us from a book published in 1889 by a reverend named J. Henry Skews called Sir John Franklin, The True Secret of the Discovery of His Fate. Skews' book claimed that it was Wheezy's vision that caused Lady Jane to point her expedition south toward Prince Regent Inlet, instead of north as she'd been planning. But this isn't actually true. In June of 1850, Lady Jane wrote in a letter that Coppin visited her after reading a newspaper account of Lady Jane's ship setting sail for Prince Regent Inlet, which implied that she'd already planned on exploring that region. It also appears that Skews' book also made Wheezy's vision out to be a lot more specific than it had been originally reported. In earlier accounts, Wheezy's vision didn't include details like the names Point Victory, Prince Regent Inlet, and Lancaster Sound. Nor did it include the map that Anne Coppin reportedly drew. This also gives us a better explanation as to how Wheezy's ghost could have come up with the name Victoria Channel when the place didn't even exist on any map yet. You see, by the time the book did come out, Victoria Channel had been officially discovered, which suggests Skews simply tossed the name in after the place was already widely known. In truth, it wasn't even the expedition sponsored by Lady Jane that found the Franklin expedition. That expedition with the schooner Prince Albert was turned away by heavy ice. Although the Prince Albert's captain, Charles Forsyth, did return to England with news that he'd learned that another expedition had found the 3 graves on Beechey Island. Both Captain John Ray and Francis McClintock, who led their own expeditions, did find vital clues to the Franklin expedition's fates, but both denied that the ghostly toddler Wheezy had anything to do with their exploratory routes. Historian Russell Porter also points out that Wheezy's visions weren't all that accurate either. Although Franklin's expedition did head south, one of the other visions Wheezy revealed was of a healthy John Franklin waving his hat from the top of his mast. This despite the fact that he would have already been dead for 2 years. But some people never let the facts get in the way of a good story. William Coppin used his newfound celebrity status from the book's publication to begin hobnobbing with several British aristocrats, who provided him with some lucrative jobs and other financial deals. There is one last quick story I'd like to share with you that we do know is true. One of the ships that was later sent out looking for the Franklin expedition was named the HMS Resolute. That ship was trapped in ice, and the crew was forced to abandon it. Later on, the Resolute was recovered by an American whaler and returned to England. Timbers from that ship were later used to construct 3 desks, one of which was presented by Queen Victoria to U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes. This has come to be known as the Resolute Desk, and it's been used by numerous presidents in the Oval Office of the White House ever since. But what do you think about the story of Wheezy and the Franklin expedition? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to hear about another historical tragedy, then click the video on the screen right now. Thanks again.